one of the words in your vocabulary almost nobody ever hears is no. It's always yes. So you get asked to do something, and you seem to always acknowledge it and do it well. So not only are you doing your amazing volume practice and doing your research, but you also spend time with OREF as a board member. And do you recall the time you spent with the board in terms of looking at projects and trying to, not necessarily sports medicine, you had to go outside different branches of orthopedics, obviously, and you had to influence others in other areas to be contributors to the OREF focus. Do you recall your time spent on that board?
Yes, it was. I would have to say that I got more out of being on that board than they got out of me. But I was there, and I learned a lot about the real workings of being a real researcher. And I took advantage of that in what I was doing with our foundations, and also began to understand how important it was to be help fund the OREF, which is really our research arm for our academy. Everybody knows that. And so I became passionate about when I got off the board, to be involved with it, and from a financial standpoint, and I'm sure that I'll continue to do so, because I think the mission of OREF is something that's essential to orthopedic surgery.
How do you think we can get our young residents to be on that same giving page? It's difficult to get them to understand how important research is. I know that funds are hard for them because they're in a lot of debt, but
I think we have to start with them when they're in medical school. I recently gave a talk at a regional medical school here on one of the days when they had guest speakers come in, and I talked to them about a whole hour about the importance of research in their educational effort. And if we can get them started involved in research like I did early on in their careers, they'll continue to do so. And if we can get them involved in OREF when they're medical students or residents, particularly as residents, if we can get them involved, and know there are programs that try to do that, then they'll be loyal to OREF for the rest of their careers. But if the same thing goes with getting them involved in research early. If you get them involved in, if you leave them and don't involve them in research when they're in medical school or residency, they're not going to get involved in research when they get out into practice academically or in clinical practice or whatever they do. So you got to start them early, both for REF and for development of their research skills. They learn to like doing research because it's rewarding.
Dr. Harris, you did mention this briefly in your description of your interest in osteolysis. I think it deserves a little more emphasis in the role that your 1960 OREF research grant played in your future research. Can you comment on that, on what role OREF played in initiating your research?
I go back to the time before there was OREF. I can picture vividly Al Shands lobbying for just such an organization to focus on research and to focus on education in musculoskeletal disease. And he mobilized the other titans of orthopedics of those eras and got the whole thing launched. And even then, while embryonic in age and small in size, it emanated vibrancy and vitality. And look at it now, with nothing but more and greater in its future. It helped me, it has helped countless others, and it serves as a beacon for the research necessary to move all of the things that we've talked about so far are part of history. They have happened. In contrast, there are three elements of my career that project forward. They're teaching, the creation of the lab, and the desire to unravel the etiology of osteoarthritis of the hip. And all three of these intertwine. Teaching. And every day began with an hour conference for everybody from medical students to staff, covering every aspect of our hip problems, 6 days a week. And the aim was to expand people's minds. My personal favorite teaching exercise was to challenge the most advanced fellow with the dilemma which says, what are you going to do when you don't know what to do? That's a very good issue to practice in the conference hall, because it surely will happen to you in the operating room. And incidentally, teaching, and particularly teaching those extraordinary fellows, is my true heritage, because these outstanding fellows are now the major contributors to leadership and advancement in joint reconstructive surgery around the world. And the fellows also played an important role in creating and sustaining the Harris Orthopedic Laboratory.
The first grant I ever received was a $3,000 grant to study methyl methacrylate from the Orthopedic Research and Education Foundation, and that was back in the early 70s. That one single $3,000 grant enabled me to write a whole bunch of papers on the mechanical properties of acrylic bone cement, and ultimately led to probably the most important paper that came out of that was the construct of being able to re-cement a well-cemented bed in a total hip arthroplasty. It really became a pretty required reading of an awful lot of residents and practitioners. And to this day, remains a way in which cemented total hip arthroplasty revision can be conducted. So that very small grant led to something, for me, as a contribution. At least it seemed to me that at the time.
Seth, just to put it in perspective, we just looked over, OREF, since its inception in 1955, has given away $120 million for orthopedic research and education. It's unbelievable. And we just looked at all the papers, research, going back to its inception. And I just want you to know that your paper, the methyl methacrylate paper, was chosen as one of the most outstanding papers over that 55, 60-year history of the organization. It's a real credit to you.
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, we got our lab started with with an OREF grant. It was a little larger than yours. No, it wasn't. It was $3,000 as well. I didn't want to go much.
A little
bit, since we're talking about OREF, in terms of the opportunity for a young individual like yourself starting out, when you're not going to get an NIH grant and you're not going to get necessarily an industrial grant, and here's OREF sitting there, really that spurred the inception of your career and was a stimulus. It is a stimulus to a lot of our young orthopedic scientists now. Do you want to just talk to that a little bit?
I'm delighted to, because I think it's really important. I think that if you think in terms of a surgeon going through medical school, going through his residency, perhaps doing a fellowship, and then wanting to get into the milieu of clinical practice and the care of patients, but you don't cease to think. Ideas develop along the way, and you need outlets. I don't see too many surgeons writing NIH grants. I mean, there are some, yes, but the great majority of joint replacement surgeons particularly care for patients. And so what little time they have to think in terms of advancing the discipline, you need to turn to somebody without commercial compromise of getting some seed money or decent sums of development dollars to begin a project. And it just doesn't apply to orthopedic surgeons. It applies to engineers and life scientists who are involved in orthopedics. And it's that, I think it's the singular most important factor that I can think of as to why it's there, why OREF is there. And it's there as a resource to facilitate. I mean, after all, when you stop and think about it, the practice of joint replacement arthroplasty today involves many papers, a lot of them not unlike the one I described as one I wrote, but many people have contributed. It's nice to have a resource along the way that helps to facilitate that for somebody who is not a pure scientist, but is a clinician, but yes, has an idea and wants to evolve it. And I think the OREF has been there for that, and I laud it for that because, quite frankly, all orthopedic surgeons, but particularly arthroplasty surgeons, should be aware of it and should be willing to help support it because so many of the developments have come out of these small grants from organizations like OREF.